Coming up on the program, Ghana's former president Jerry John Rawlings dies at the age of 73. U.S. President-elect Joe Biden announces Chief of Staff holds phone calls with foreign leaders. And Chinese government condemns mass resignation of most of Hong Kong's opposition from parliament as an open challenge to its authority. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Joke Rogers. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo has declared 7 days of national mourning following the death of former president and military ruler Jerry Rawlings. Mr. Akufo-Addo also says he's suspending campaigning for next month's election and flags would fly at half-mast. The 7-day mourning period will start on Friday. Former President Rawlings died at a state hospital in the capital, Accra, at the age of 73. Ghana's former president, Jerry John Rawlings, led 2 coups as a senior officer in the Ghana Air Force. First in 1979, after which he handed over to a civilian government, and then 2 years later. He headed the military junta until the introduction of multi-party elections in 1992, when he was first elected president. He stepped down in 2001 after serving 2 terms. A charismatic figure, Jerry Rawlings came into power in 1979 in a move against corruption. In the few months that he led the country in 1979, he was responsible for executing several former heads of state and army generals for their alleged graft and mismanagement.
Come on. I think so we can have some ventilation.
Mr. Rawlings was also seen as a champion of the poor and began his time in power as a committed socialist. He later introduced free market reforms and ushered in a long period of political stability. That continues today after a tumultuous series of coups in the 1960s and 1970s. We'll get more reactions to his death in just a moment, but let's take a look at some other stories. U.S. President-elect Joe Biden has picked veteran political operative Ron Klein to be the next White House Chief of Staff. Mr. Klein has served as a top aide to Mr. Biden since the 1980s in the Senate and later when he was vice president. The ultimate Washington insider, Mr. Klein, was also a senior White House aide to Barack Obama and Chief of Staff to Vice President Al Gore. Meanwhile, Mr. Biden is pressing ahead with preparations to resume the presidency, despite Mr. Trump's lack of a concession after all major U.S. TV networks projected last Saturday that the Democrat had won the White House race. On Wednesday, he continued to field phone calls from foreign leaders, speaking to Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Well, U.S. and international affairs analyst Calvin Dark joins us now for more on this. Calvin, firstly, what do you make of, the U.S. President-elect Joe Biden's choice of Ron Klein as his White House Chief of Staff?
Well, I think it represents 2 things. One is that Klein has worked not only in the Obama administration, but he has worked for Joe Biden, I think not only as vice president, but as senator before that. So he's going with someone that he knows and someone that knows him. Also, in this very, very charged environment, where we're already seeing the blocks with the transition teams between the Trump administration and the President-elect Biden's team, you're going to need somebody that from day one has been in the White House, knows where everything is, knows how everything works. And so I think it was a really great choice because in Klein, that's what he's getting.
And the president-elect is pledged to put in place one of the most diverse presidential cabinets ever. What can we expect in the coming weeks?
I think what we'll start to see is what I think we should have seen all the time, and that's a cabinet and a government that reflects our country, that reflects the diversity that we have, and reflects the diversity of opinions. Because yes, I think the cabinet is going to look different, but I also think with Joe Biden, in the great relationships he has with Republicans, I think you're going to see some Republicans or more moderate leaning right folks, just to make sure that not only in the way we look, but in the way that we think, there is diversity.
It's been days since the White House race was called for Democrat Joe Biden, but Donald Trump is yet to concede or show any signs of acknowledging his defeat. How do you see this ending?
Well, just on a practical level, I see it ending on January 20th, because that's the Constitution. It's not a date that President Trump or anyone else can move before then. I do think that it is hampering the transition efforts, which only hurts our country, particularly in the pandemic, if you have an incoming administration that doesn't have access to all the information it needs. And I'll go ahead and tell you, one of the things, too, that I'm worried about is I am here in Washington, D.C. There are advertisements for a huge rally for Trump to not steal the election by people, who have been on social media with guns and with very threatening, signs and all of that. So that's also in the mix. I don't think that's going to be as big of a deal as they're saying it will, because I think most Americans realize the election was over, Joe Biden won, and President Trump is president until January 20th.
So finally, many, not all, world leaders have congratulated Joe Biden over his victory. And of course, many, not all, have expressed confidence or readiness to work with him when he's eventually, inaugurated, however it pans out, with all the lawsuits and all. But what does this mean, his victory mean for the rest of the world in terms of the U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I think the overall benefit that a Biden administration will have on foreign policy is that we will get a little bit back to normal. I don't think there will be the unpredictability or the lack of strategy or the racist comments or the kind of ignorance of how the world works that we've had in the Trump administration. So I think that is a plus. Now, also, it doesn't mean that everything that Biden has on his agenda internationally is going to solve our issues with our foreign partners. That we don't know, and that is what governing is about. We're going to have experts. We're going to pursue the best policies according to President Biden, and hopefully we will improve. So it's not exactly a promise on certain specific things being resolved, but I think it is a guarantee that things will get back to normal and strategic and something that we're more used to.
Right, U.S. and International Affairs analyst Calvin Dark speaking to us there. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Let's move on. China's government has condemned the mass resignation of most of Hong Kong's opposition as a farce and an open challenge to its authority. On Wednesday, 15 opposition members announced their resignation in solidarity with 4 fellow lawmakers who had been dismissed. Beijing says the 4 were deemed a threat to national security, but many see it as further restricting Hong Kong's rights, including freedom of speech, which Beijing denies.
And the worst of all is, according to the basic law, there are separation of power under the stipulation of the basic law. But today, the decision made by the central government simply say that all the separation of power will be taken away and all the power will be centralized in the chief executive. Of course, chief executive is the puppet of the central government. So as a result, that is the basic argument why we say today is the end of the one country, two system.
And you have to note that this is not just a single event of unseating a certain number of legislators and then forcing the rest of us to quit. This is an actual act by Beijing to their thinking to to sound the death knell of Hong Kong's democracy fight, because they would think that from now on, anyone they found to be politically incorrect or unpatriotic or simply not likable to look at, they could just oust you.
More reactions to the story. Britain accuses China of breaking a major bilateral treaty on Hong Kong by imposing new rules to disqualify elected legislators in the former British colony, cautioning that it would work with allies to hold Beijing to account. Hong Kong's autonomy was guaranteed under the One Country, Two Systems agreement enshrined in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration ahead of the territory's return to Chinese rule in 1997. The agreement was signed by then Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
It is my unfortunate duty to report to this House our judgment that this decision breaches the legally binding Sino-British Joint Declaration. It breaches both China's commitment that Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy and the right to freedom of speech guaranteed under paragraph 3 of the Declaration. This is the third time the government has called a breach of the Joint Declaration since 1997. But the second time we've been forced to do so in the last 6 months. The decision is part of a pattern designed to harass and stifle all voices critical of China's policies. The new rules for disqualification provide a further tool in this campaign, with vague criteria open to wide-ranging interpretation. Hong Kong's people are left now with a neutered legislature. 15 pan-democratic legislators have already resigned en masse in protest. China has yet again broken its promise to the people of Hong Kong. Its actions tarnish China's international reputation and undermine Hong Kong's long-term stability.
And reacting to that, China says remarks made by the UK and US about the recent disqualification of Hong Kong lawmakers were unreasonable. China's foreign ministry spokesman said during a daily news conference that the countries have no right to comment on the qualification issue of Hong Kong's Legislative Council. The Chinese Parliament earlier adopted a resolution allowing the city's executive to expel lawmakers deemed to be advocating Hong Kong independence, colluding with foreign forces or threatening national security without having to go through the courts. Well, in other news affecting Britain, the government says it's determined to secure a trade deal with the European Union and is working hard to close the gaps in negotiating positions. That's according to Michael Gove, the minister in charge of implementing the divorce deal. He says the European Union must show flexibility to help secure a free trade deal with Britain, particularly in Northern Ireland, where the easy movement of goods must be maintained with the rest of the United Kingdom.
Of course, we're determined to secure a deal, and that is why our negotiators under Lord Frost are working hard with Michel Barnier to close the remaining gaps in the negotiations. As to the number of customs agents, 50,000 was always an estimate. It is the case there's been a significant increase in them. And of course, while we've seen a significant increase in readiness amongst businesses and citizens, there is still more to do, which is why I would encourage everybody who needs to go to www.gov.uk/transition, where there are a range of tools to help people make the changes that they need for life after the end of the transition period.
French President Emmanuel Macron has welcomed the head of the International Monetary Fund and the presidents of the European Council and Senegal at the Elysee Presidential Palace. Macron's meeting with the IMF's Kristalina Georgieva, the EU Council's Charles Michel, and Senegalese counterpart Macky Sall. The meeting came ahead of the Paris Peace Forum, in which heads of state and global agencies called for a multilateral response to the COVID-19 pandemic that has been gripping the world for months, and condemned terrorism amid a recent spate of suspected Islamist attacks in Europe. Some 50 heads of state and dozens of representatives of NGOs, companies and global agencies took part in the virtual third edition of a forum hosted by French President Macron and focuses on finding a global solution to the pandemic. Leaders including Canada's Justin Trudeau and New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, who is widely praised for her handling of the health crisis, urged equitable access to potential vaccines. Well, dozens of rescuers scrambled to evacuate trapped residents living at a suburb in Manila today after Typhoon Vamco's strong winds and torrential rains inundated the Philippine capital and several provinces in the main island of Luzon, leaving at least 7 people dead. The typhoon, the 8th to hit the Philippines in the past 2 months and 21st of the year, forced residents to climb onto rooftops to await rescue after tens of thousands of homes were submerged. It struck areas still reeling from Goni, the most powerful typhoon in the world this year, which killed 25 people and destroyed thousands of homes earlier this month. Nearly 200,000 people were evacuated from before Vamco arrived late on Wednesday, packing winds of 155 kilometers per hour and gusts of up to 255 kilometers per hour. It has since weakened and left the mainland. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, has warned of a growing humanitarian emergency among civilians forced to flee fighting between federal troops and local forces in the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. And Contre, the agency's representatives in the country, says that neighboring Sudan has already received more than 10,000 Ethiopian refugees since the fighting began. She adds that the region is running low on food, fuel, and other basic commodities. She also warns that the conflict has opened up the possibility of sexual exploitation of women and children.
Turning to Ethiopia, our humanitarian colleagues say they remain concerned about the ongoing tensions in Tigray region and their impact on civilians. We, along with our partners, are working with the authorities to ensure the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, continued access to people in need of assistance, and availability of funding given increasing needs. We are told that communications continue to be disrupted. There are also reports of intermittent electricity supply shortages, as well as shortages of basic commodities such as flour and fuel are also being reported. Banks remain closed and the shortage of available cash is becoming much more acute. The closure of banks and inaccessibility to the region hamper our humanitarian operations, including the traditional humanitarian cash transfers to 1 million people. UNHCR tells us they are working with authorities in Sudan to help more than 7,000 refugees who fled Ethiopia in the past 2 days. This obviously following the clashes in Tigray region. UNHCR and local authorities are screening and registering people who are arriving in Sudan. More refugees from Ethiopia are expected to arrive in neighboring countries. Our UNHCR colleagues are stepping up their preparations for emergency relief by working with governments and partners.
UK's president has been hospitalized after he contracted coronavirus earlier this week. He said on Monday that he tested positive for coronavirus. 3 other top officials of the government, including the finance minister, the defense minister, and his other top aide, were also reported to be infected. Ukraine's daily tally of new coronavirus infections began spiking in late September and has remained consistently high in number in October and November, spurring the government to extend some restrictions until the end of the year. On Wednesday, the cabinet voted to impose a national lockdown at weekends to strengthen steps to curb the rapid spread of the virus. Meanwhile, South Africa has scrapped the list of banned countries from which travelers were initially not allowed into the country. Speaking to the nation last night, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced several measures opening up the economy further, but appealed to citizens to keep adhering to anti-COVID regulations. He also announced that from the 25th to the 29th of this month, 5 days of national mourning will be observed in honor of those who died of COVID-19 and gender-based violence.
The president's announcements to open up the economy and international travel further came with a plea for continued adherence to the COVID health safety regulations to avoid going back to harder lockdown.
Wearing a mask every time we leave home is far, far better than having a second wave. It is also far better than a return to lockdown and better than having to shut down our economy once again.
As expected, the aviation and general tourism sectors are happier and hopeful something could be salvaged of the business year.
We certainly welcome the announcement by President Ramaphosa last night to open the borders and effectively do away with the high-risk list. And it really enables us now to start looking at really realizing potential for the full recovery of the aviation, travel and tourism industry. So it's very good news for us.
It will take long to fully recover, but immediately once everything is open, we are just already hoping to get bookings where we could fetch some tourists from the airport, and then also the hotel starting to be full. Then because also places are open right now like Table Mountain, Cape Point, wine tasting, then we'll be busy. Yes, it will take time to recover fully, but gradually we will make it.
Amidst all the hope is still the worry that opening up to international travelers could worsen the already worrisome COVID stats South Africa is experiencing today.
Opening up travel at this stage to countries around the world does not pose a serious risk to us because we are insisting that individuals have a PCR test within 72 hours. And for those countries where that's not possible, an antigen test, a rapid test, where you get an answer in 15 minutes, is available now in the ports of entry.
It's been a tough 10 months for the aviation and tourism sector in particular. Hopefully, these empty spaces will fill out this holiday season in a safe manner.
It's been a really long and tough wait for the tourism sector as well as the many affiliated business sectors to get back to business. Hopefully now with the pronouncement of government, they will begin an equally long journey to recovery. From the Table Mountain, Cape Town, South Africa, Betty Dibia, Channels Television News.
After over 6 months of going without human contact, elderly patients are beaming with happiness after getting a serious hug or kiss from their relatives in a care home in northern Italy. A special hug room has been organized that keeps both parties safe from coronavirus infection. Staff at the Domenico Sarto care home arranged several hug areas, one with plastic for full body hugs and another simply with the ability to touch hands, which has brought visible joy to everyone. The care workers realized it was becoming increasingly important that their elderly patients received some human contact from loved ones. Most had gone without a hug since March when the virus took hold of the north of the country. Simply keeping safe was not enough. The elderly were getting depressed and missed the contact. That's it on The World Today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Joker Rogers. Stay tuned for sports news at 6 p.m.